we have learned about the characteristic truth tables of the Boolean connectives. We can now use this knowledge to construct truth tables for more complex sentences that may contain more than just one connective. How does that go? Well, here are the basic steps. We start by constructing our assessment column by writing the sentence S that we want to analyze at the very top. Next, we need to identify the atomic sentences in the sentence S that we want to analyze. And we need to construct the reference column, making sure that the reference column contains one column for each of our atomic sentences. In the fourth step, we then start to fill in the columns under all connectives in S in our assessment column, beginning with the innermost. I'm going to illustrate what that means in just a second. And then finally, the column under the main connective in S tells us the truth value of S as a function of the truth values of its constituent sentences. Let's look at a few examples to see how that works. Let's look at a few examples to see how we may construct truth tables for more complex sentences. Here's our first example. If C, then not C. I'm going to start construct my truth table simply by dividing the assessment column from the reference column. The reference column is on the left, the assessment column is on the right. And you can see that this sentence contains just one atomic sentence, namely C. And I'm going to put this sentence at the top of my reference column. And I know that an atomic sentence always has two possible valuations. It can either be true or false. So here I have constructed my reference column, my one atomic sentence on the top, and then the two possible valuations underneath. Now let's see how we can fill in our assessment column on the right-hand side. I'm going to start with the innermost connective. So when you think about this sentence with all its brackets, it would look like this. And the innermost connective is my negation sign there. Since that connective is inside two brackets and doesn't contain any brackets within its scope. So I know that not C is false when C is true, and that's why I'm going to enter an F in this row here. And I know that not C is true when C is false, so I'm going to enter a T in this row here. Okay, that was the first step. I have entered the two possible truth values, or the two possible valuations under not C as a function of the truth value of T. Next, we need to fill in the column under the conditional. Now I know that when the antecedent of the conditional, which is C, is true, but the consequent, which is not C, is false, in that case, the whole conditional is false. And that's why I'm going to enter an F here. I also know that a conditional is true whenever the antecedent is false. And since the antecedent of our conditional is the sentence A, I'm going to enter a T in the second row here, given that in the second row, C is false. And that completes the truth table. Our main connective is the conditional, and we see that this sentence is false on the first valuation where C is true, and true on the second valuation where C is false. Let's look at a second example. This time we have a sentence with two atomic constituents. The sentence that we are going to analyze here is this one: if D and not D, then G. And I'm going to start to construct my truth table by dividing the reference column from the assessment column. I'm going to put my 2 atomic sentences D and G up here, and then I'm going to fill in the reference column by writing out all the possible valuations for my 2 atomic sentences. So for 2 atomic sentences, we are going to have 4 possible valuations: TT, TF, FT, and FF. That's the 4 possible valuations. Okay, I've identified the atomic sentences, I've constructed my reference column, and now I can move on and fill in the assessment column. Let's start with the innermost connective. In this case, the innermost connective is the negation sign before D. That connective is in the scope of the conjunction sign and does not contain any other connectives in its scope. So we know that not D is false when D is true. So I'm going to enter an F, another F here. Not D is true when D is false. I'm going to enter a T here and another T in the final row. So that completes my column under the negation sign. Next, I move on to the conjunction sign. I know that a conjunction is true if and only if both conjuncts are true. And in this case, the 2 conjuncts are D and not D. So I'm going to look at this column here and this column here in order to figure out the possible truth values of my conjunction. Now in the first row, the conjunction is false because the second conjunct is false. In the second row, the conjunction is false again because the second conjunct is false. In the third row, the conjunction is false because the first conjunct is false. And in the final row, the conjunction again is false because the first conjunct is false. So that completes the column under the conjunction sign. Okay, let's finally move on to the conditional. I know that the truth value of a conditional depends on the truth value of its antecedent and the truth value of its consequent. So in this case, the antecedent of the conditional is this whole conjunction here. And so I need to look at the column under the conjunction sign when I want to determine the truth value of my conditional. And the consequent is the atomic sentence G, so I also need to look at this column here. Now let's think about the first valuation. The conditional is true whenever the antecedent of the conditional is false. And since in the first row the antecedent is false, I know that this conditional must be true. Same thing happens in the second row. I see that the antecedent is true, so the whole conditional must be true. Same thing in the third row, and same thing in the fourth row. So what we have seen here is that given that the antecedent of this conditional is false on every possible valuation, it follows that the conditional itself is true on every possible valuation. Let's look at a third example. In this case, we have a sentence with 3 atomic constituents, namely D, R, and I. I'm going to start constructing my truth table for the sentence by dividing the reference column from the assessment column and putting my 3 atomic sentences at the top of the reference column, D, R, and I. Now with 3 atomic sentences, I know that my truth table is going to have 8 rows, one for each of the possible valuations. So let's start to fill this in. The 3 sentences could all be true, or one of the 3 sentences could be false. Or 2 of the sentences could be false. Or finally, all 3 sentences could be false. 8 possible valuations, 8 rows in my truth table. Next, we are going to move on and fill in the assessment column, starting with the innermost connective. Now, this case is actually interesting because, in a sense, we have 2 innermost connectives. The disjunction sign and the conjunction sign are both all the way inside, so to speak. They don't have any other connectives in their scope. So in that case where you have 2 innermost connectives, you can just pick and choose and fill in either one of the 2 columns before the other. I'll just start at the left and start to fill in the column under the conjunction sign. So I know that a conjunction is true if and only if both conjuncts are true. So I need to look at the truth values of D and R. And I see that D and R are both true in the first and in the second row. And that's it. There's no other row in which both are true. So I'm going to enter a T and a T and then F all the way down. Good. That was our first column. Next, let's look at the disjunction here. I know that a disjunction is true just in case at least one of the 2 disjuncts is true. So I need to look at the truth values of D and of R again to figure out the truth value of this disjunction. Now I see in the first 3 rows D is true, so the disjunction is going to be true. And in the 4th row R is true, so the disjunction is going to be true again. So I'm going to enter a T in the first 4 rows. T, 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 and T. Now the 5th row, I see that both D and R are false, so I'm going to enter an F. And in the 6th and 7th row, one of the 2 is true, so I'm going to enter T and T again. And then in the final row, they are both false, so I'm going to enter an F representing false. Okay, that was our second column. We have finished both the conjunction and the disjunction. Now, the negation sign here is easy. The negation sign negates the disjunction here. So to fill in the column under the negation sign, I'm just going to flip the truth values under the disjunction sign. So not D or R is false when D or R is true. False, 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 false. It is true when the disjunction is false. False when the disjunction is true. And that completes the column under the negation sign. Next, I'm going to look at the column under the conditional. Now, the antecedent of this conditional is this conjunction here. So I need to look at this whole column to determine the truth value of the conditional. And the consequent of the conditional is the atomic sentence I. So I also need to look at this column here. Now I know that a conditional is true in all cases where the antecedent is false. So that means that I can enter a T in all of these rows where our antecedent is false. Now, in the cases where the antecedent is true, I need to be a little more careful. So we see that in the first row, both the antecedent and the consequent are true, so I'm going to enter a T here. But in the second row, the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, so I need to enter an F. Okay, we are almost done. We only need to fill in one more column, And that final column is the column under our main connective, which is the second conditional. Okay, the antecedent of this conditional is this whole big sentence here, which is itself a conditional sentence. And we know that the main connective of this sentence is the first conditional sign. So that means that in order to determine the choose value or the valuation under the second conditional, I need to look at this column here under the first conditional. Now the consequent of the conditional is this complex sentence here, and the main connective of that sentence is the negation sign. So that means that I also need to look at this column here. The first column that I circled around represents the possible choose values of the antecedent of the conditional, and the second column that I circled around represents the possible choose values of the consequent of the conditional. Now, let's start to fill in the column under our main connective, under the conditional. In the first row, we see that the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, so the whole conditional is false. In the second row, the antecedent is false, so the conditional is true. In the third row, the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, so the conditional is false. In the fourth row, the same thing happens again. In the fifth row, both the antecedent and the consequent are true, so the conditional is true. The antecedent is true and the consequent is false, so the whole conditional is false. And finally, both antecedent and consequent are true, so the whole conditional is true. So this completes our truth table. Our main connective is this conditional here. And in the column under this main connective, we can read off the possible truth values of our sentence as a function of the possible truth values of the constituent atomic sentences.